Agent hung up on Black woman mid-audition. She opened her own agency and signed the agent's biggest client. The line went dead on the fourth line of the monologue. Not a dropped call, not a technical failure. She could hear him breathing before it happened, the specific, pointed silence of someone deciding. And then the click. Clean and deliberate. The kind that arrives with a message attached, even without words. She was standing in her kitchen. She had cleared the table to give herself room to move. She had taped the sides of a rectangle on the floor with blue painter's tape, the size of a standard audition mark, because she believed in doing things the right way even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. She had a glass of water on the counter and the sides she had printed and annotated in her handwriting. She had been preparing that monologue for 11 days. 4 lines in. Click. His name was Sterling Pruitt. He had been a talent agent in Los Angeles for 22 years. He ran a boutique agency on Wilshire Boulevard that represented 14 working actors, including one actor whose face was currently on the side of a bus on the 405, and who was in pre-production on a studio film with a budget large enough that the trades had mentioned it twice. He had listened to 4 lines of her audition and hung up. She stood in the taped rectangle in her kitchen. She did not call back. She did not cry, though there was something in her chest that deserved a word. She set her phone face down on the counter. She looked at her sides. She picked them up and read the rest of the monologue aloud, all the way through to the empty kitchen. Correctly, fully, the way she had prepared it. When she finished, she picked up her notebook, sat down at the cleared table, and opened it to a blank page. Her name is Imara Cole. She is 41 years old now. When Sterling Pruitt hung up the phone, she was 33. 8 years is a long time. It is also exactly the amount of time it took for her to build something from a taped rectangle on a kitchen floor and a blank page in a notebook. 8 years after that click, the biggest client on Sterling Pruitt's roster, the actor whose face was on the bus on the 405, would sign with Imara's agency, voluntarily, on his own initiative, because she had spent 8 years becoming the person he wanted in his corner. Nobody knew that yet. Sterling Pruitt especially did not know it. Nobody knows what a blank page is going to hold until the person holding the pen decides. Subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Now come back with me. Not to the kitchen, back further. Back to before the tape on the floor and the sides and the glass of water. Back to where Imara Cole first understood what the work actually was. Imara Cole grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in a family where performance was a form of language, not theater, not formal performance. The kind that happens in living rooms and church basements and school gymnasiums and family gatherings where certain people have the gift of presence, the ability to hold a room with a story, to make a moment feel larger than it was by the quality of attention they brought to it. Her mother, a woman named Celestine, was that person. Celestine Cole worked as a school administrator during the week and sang in the church choir on Sundays and could tell a story at a dinner table that made people set down their forks. Not because the story was extraordinary, because the way she told it made you understand that every story is extraordinary when the person telling it has decided to honor it. Imara absorbed this the way children absorb the essential things, not by being taught, but by being in the presence of it often enough that it became the baseline, the way things were supposed to be. You gave the material its full weight. You did not rush it. You let the silence do its work. You understood that the person receiving the story was in a relationship with you, and that the relationship required something from both sides, and that your job was to give them something worth receiving. She started acting at 11. Not as a career plan, she was 11, and career plans were not the point. Because she had done a scene in a 6th grade social studies unit and something had happened that she could not name but that she recognized, the way you recognize a thing you have been looking for before you knew you were looking. The thing that happened was that she disappeared into someone else's experience so completely that for 4 minutes she was not Imara Cole in a classroom, and then she came back. And the coming back was also something she could not name. A specific return to herself that felt more like herself than she had been before the leaving. She pursued it, not chaotically, with the focused, organized attention of a person who understood, from Celestine, that things worth doing were worth doing with care. She took classes through the city's arts programs. She read plays. She watched films not as entertainment but as study, pausing and rewinding and asking herself what the actor had done and why and what it had cost them. She kept a journal not about acting, about the things she observed in the world that a character might use, the way grief moved through a body, the quality of attention a person gave when they were pretending to listen versus when they were actually listening, the difference between performing an emotion and having it. She was cataloging the raw material of human behavior with the systematic care of someone who understood it was her primary resource. She was 18 when she understood clearly that this was the work, not a hobby, not a backup, the work. Celestine's response to this, when Amara told her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night her senior year of high school, was not cautionary. Celestine was a practical woman, and she had practical questions. What is the plan? What does the first 5 years look like? What do you know about the industry that you don't know yet? And the last question, the one that Imara carried with her all the way to a kitchen in Los Angeles 15 years later. Who do you need to become to do this well? Imara went to a conservatory program on the East Coast. 4 years of formal training in the specific rigor of theater voice, movement, text analysis, scene study, the technical apparatus that takes what is intuitive in a gifted person and makes it reliable, repeatable, available not only when inspiration arrives, but when the call sheet says 6 a.m. and the inspiration has not. She was a serious student. Not the most overtly talented person in her cohort, there were people in her program whose gifts arrived more flamboyantly, who could floor a room in the first workshop. Imara's gifts were deeper than the surface. Her teachers noticed it over time, the way you notice things that build slowly. A precision of psychological understanding that most young actors didn't yet have the vocabulary for. An ability to find the stillness inside a scene that made everything moving around the stillness more visible. One of her teachers, a man named Robert Farley, who had been directing theater for 30 years, wrote in her end-of-year evaluation, "She has the rarest quality in this work. She understands that the audience sees everything. Nothing is small enough to not matter." She kept the evaluation. It went into a folder that also held her acceptance letter to the conservatory, a note from Celestine on her first opening night, and 3 other documents she considered foundational. The folder lived in her work bag, not in a box, because foundational things are for access, not storage. After the conservatory, she moved to New York, the logical first city. 3 years of off Broadway and casting director workshops, and the specific grinding endurance of a life built on the commitment to something that the market is chronically reluctant to commit to in return. She had day jobs. She had a restaurant job for 14 months that taught her more about managing people under pressure than any class she had ever taken, and she noted this without irony in the journal because she was already, without fully naming it yet, paying attention to the operational layer beneath the artistic one, how things ran, what made environments work, what made them fail, who had the ability to hold a room not just on stage but in the infrastructure that put people on stages. She moved to Los Angeles at 28, not because New York had stopped, but because the work she wanted required the coexistence of theater and film and television that Los Angeles offered and New York did not. And because she had done the research, she was always doing the research, and she had identified 3 casting directors and 2 directors whose work she wanted to be in conversation with, and all 5 of them operated out of Los Angeles. And that was sufficient reason. She had no agent when she arrived. She had a resume. She had a reel from the New York work. She had the folder. She had a journal in its 14th volume. She spent 3 years submitting directly to casting directors while simultaneously building the relationships that the industry runs on, not through schmoozing, which was not her register, but through the slower, more durable practice of showing up fully prepared for every opportunity, and then following up with the intelligence of someone who had studied the room. She got callbacks. She got small roles. She built a record of professionalism so consistent that several casting directors began calling her directly for projects before submissions opened. What she did not have was agency representation, and the absence of it was becoming the ceiling. There were roles she could not be submitted for without a signed agent. There were conversations that required a representative in the room that she could not have herself. The industry's architecture required it. She had known this for years and had been building toward it, building her record, her relationships, her reel in the faith that the architecture would admit her when she had enough to offer. She submitted to 14 agencies over 2 years. 4 did not respond. 6 declined inform letters. 3 took meetings that went nowhere. 1 put her on an interest list that never converted to an offer. Sterling Pruitt's agency was a referral. A casting director she had worked with 3 times, a woman named Denise Kagawa, had mentioned Imara to Sterling directly and told him to take the call. Sterling had agreed because Denise was someone whose recommendations he valued, and he had set up a phone audition, which was the format his agency used for initial evaluations of actors he had not seen live. She had prepared for 11 days. 4 lines. Click. She sat at the cleared kitchen table with the blank page in front of her, and she wrote one thing at the top. Not a plan. Not a vow. A question. The way Celestine had taught her to start with questions. Who do I need to become to do this well? Then she turned the page and began to answer it. What she wrote in the notebook that night was not a business plan. It was more preliminary than that. It was the honest accounting of what she knew and what she did not know yet, and what the gap between those two things required of her. She knew performance. She knew text. She knew the psychology of character at a level of granularity that most working actors did not, because she had spent 22 years building that knowledge with the systematic attention of someone for whom nothing was too small to matter. She knew casting directors, 8 of them by name, by taste, by the specific things that their work was looking for. She knew what made a room want to keep watching something. She understood, from the restaurant and from 3 years of navigating New York's theater ecosystem, and from observation during the Los Angeles years, the operational infrastructure of creative environments. What she did not know was representation, the contractual architecture, the deal structures, the commission conventions, the leverage dynamics between agencies and studios and production companies, the specific way that an agent built and maintained a client roster, the business layer that sat above the creative layer and controlled access to it. She enrolled, the week after the phone call, in an entertainment law and industry contracts course offered through a university extension program in Los Angeles. Night classes, 3 times a week, 16 weeks. She was the only person in the room who was an actor. Everyone else was a lawyer or an aspiring business affairs executive or an MBA student with a film industry interest. She sat in those classes with the same focused, foundational attention she had brought to the conservatory 20 years earlier. She asked the questions that were not covered in the syllabus. She stayed after to talk to the instructor, a working entertainment attorney named Carla Vinson, who became, through the slow accumulation of these conversations over 16 weeks, someone who could see what Imara was building before Imara had named it to herself. At the end of the course, Carla Vinson said, "You're going to open an agency." Imara looked at her. It was the first time she had heard the sentence from outside her own head. She said, "I'm still acting," Carla said. "I know, and you're going to open an agency." A pause. "I've watched you in this room for 4 months. You don't learn the way people learn when they're studying an industry. You learn the way people learn when they're going to build something inside one." Imara did not argue. She walked to her car and drove home and opened the notebook and turned to the question she had written the night of the phone call, and she wrote beneath it, for the first time, a 1-sentence answer. "I need to become the person who builds the room that wouldn't let me in." She spent the next 2 years building the knowledge she did not yet have. Not as preparation for an agency, she was careful about that. Careful not to name it too soon, because named things attract the energy that must be spent on them before the foundation is ready, but as the next phase of what she had always done. Studying the room she wanted to be in until she understood it well enough to deserve to be there, she took a position as an assistant at a mid-sized talent agency, not Sterling Pruitt's, a different one, a company that managed a roster of primarily below-the-line talent, where the volume of transactions was high and the margins were thin, and she would see more deal structures and contracts and negotiation dynamics in a month than, She would in a year of the boutique world. She was 35. She had been the person getting the coffee and making the copies on film sets at 23, and she approached this with the same equanimity. The work you do to understand something is the work. The title is not the point. She worked at the agency for 18 months. She learned what she went there to learn. She took notes in the journal, the 15th volume by then, with the same systematic discipline she had brought to every phase. Not what happened, but why, and what it meant, and what it would look like when applied differently. She gave her notice on a Monday morning in September. She had 2 clients when she opened Vela Talent, named for her grandmother, on the first Monday of October. Both were actors she had known since the New York years, both mid-career, both at a stage where the representation they had was adequate, and the representation they needed was something more than adequate. She had not recruited them. She had told them what she was building, honestly and in detail, and they had asked to come with her. She had signed them with contracts that Carla Vinson had reviewed and that were structured in the specific way that Imara, having spent 18 months on the inside, knew was fair. Fair to the client. Fair to the agency. Fair in the durable sense that fair things tend to last. She ran Vela Talent from a single office in East Hollywood with 1 assistant, a young woman named Priya who had graduated from a film studies program 8 months prior and who had found the job listing on a community board and who had come to the interview with a 1-page analysis of 3 recent agency deals that she had identified as structurally significant. Imara hired her on the spot and told her why, not because of the analysis, which was good, but because of the practice of preparing it when it had not been required. She had learned that from Celestine. The ones who do the work before anyone asks are the ones you build with. In the first year, Vela Talent signed 6 clients. None of them were famous. All of them were working, or about to be working, or at a threshold that Imara's eye, 22 years of watching what the camera wants, what a room wants, what the long arc of a career wants, could identify as the kind of threshold that the right representation crosses rather than stalls at. She was not building a roster of names. She was building a roster of trajectories. She worked the relationships she had. Denise Kagawa, the casting director who had referred her to Sterling Pruitt, the referral that had ended in 4 lines and a click, had not stopped believing in Imara's instincts. She called Denise the week Vela opened, not to announce the agency, to ask Denise to coffee the way she had always asked, because the relationship had never been transactional and was not going to become transactional because of a change in Imara's business structure. They had coffee. They talked about the work. At the end, Imara told Denise what she was doing. Denise said, "It's about time." In the 3rd year, a director named Callum Hayes came to Denise with a project. He had a script, a film, independent financing, a production timeline that was aggressive but achievable, a lead role that required someone who could carry a complex interior life without the shortcuts that more conventional actors reached for. Callum had specific instincts about what the role needed, and he had gone to Denise because Denise was the casting director he trusted when the role was specific. Denise thought of 3 actors. She mentioned all 3 to Callum. One of them was a Vela Talent client, a man named Devin Park, 38 years old, Korean-American, who had spent 12 years building a career in supporting roles in projects where he was reliably the most interesting person on screen for the 18 minutes the script gave him. Imara had signed Devin in Vela's 2nd year, not because she had a specific project in mind, but because she could see what 12 years of that reliability built in an actor, and she wanted to be representing it when the right project arrived. The right project had arrived. Devin read for Callum. Then he read again. Then Callum called Imara and said, "I want him for this. What does his situation look like?" Imara negotiated the deal over 4 days. She knew the financing structure of the project she had asked, because she always asked, and she knew what was possible within it, and she knew what Devin's trajectory required, and she built a negotiation that honored all 3 things simultaneously. The fee was above what the film's above-the-line budget had initially allocated for the role. She had identified where there was flexibility in the structure, and she had applied it precisely. She had also negotiated points on the back end, a smaller percentage than a larger agency would have demanded. Because Imara understood that the project itself was the more valuable thing, and that terms that served the project were terms that ultimately served Devon. The film shot over 6 weeks in Georgia and California. Devon's performance was what it always was, which was to say, the most interesting thing on screen for every minute the script gave him, except that this time the script gave him 94 minutes and a role that asked for everything he had built in 12 years and more. The film premiered at a festival in January. Callum had submitted it to 3. It got into all 3. It sold on the second day of the market, to a distributor that had the platform and the appetite to take it wide. The reviews were specific in the way good reviews are specific, not just praise, but attention to the detail of what Devon had done and how he had done it. One critic wrote that watching Devon Park in the film was like watching someone finally be given enough space to show what they were actually made of. Imara read the review twice and then put the notebook down without writing anything in it, because some things do not need annotation. Some things you simply know. The film opened wide in April. By May, Devon Park's phone was full of messages. So was Imara's. Marcus Webb was Sterling Pruitt's biggest client. He was the actor on the bus on the 405. He was in post-production on the studio film the trades had mentioned. And he was, as actors sometimes are, after a run of commercially successful work that has not quite required the full measure of what they are capable of. Quietly, privately looking for something different. Not different work necessarily, a different relationship to his work. A different quality of conversation about what his career was doing and where it was going. A representative who was engaged not only in the transaction but in the trajectory. He had been watching the Callum Hayes film conversation from a distance. He had seen the reviews. He had asked his manager, casually, who was repping Devon Park, and his manager had said Vela Talent, and Marcus had said, "Who is that?" And his manager had said the name Imara Cole, and Marcus had gone looking, the way people go looking when they want to know something. He found the shape of what Vela was. Not the client list, though the list was strong. The philosophy. The specific way Imara talked about her clients in the trade press interviews she had done, not in the transactional language of deals closed, but in the language of a person who understood that a career was a thing built over time, and that building it required a partner with a long enough horizon to see beyond the current project. He called Imara directly, not through his manager. He called Vela's main line on a Thursday morning in June and asked to speak with Imara, Cole, and Priya, who had been at Vela for 3 years by then and who had heard Imara prepare for 17 meetings but had never prepared her for this one, put him through. Imara's voice, when she took the call, was what it always was. The voice of someone who had decided, at 11 years old, that presence was the work, and who had spent 30 years practicing it. She said, "Mr. Webb, I've admired your work for a long time." He said, "I've been watching what you're building. I think I'd like to be part of it." They met the following Tuesday at Vela's office, which had moved, by then, from the single East Hollywood room to a proper suite in a building in Silver Lake, with 4 offices and 2 conference rooms and 6 full-time staff, and a roster of 23 clients. Priya was at the front desk when Marcus Webb walked in, and she did not react in the way of someone starstruck, and she did not fail to react in the way of someone pretending not to know who she was looking at. She greeted him the way she greeted everyone. By name, correctly, with the full attention of someone whose job was to make people feel that where they were was exactly where they were supposed to be. Imara came out to meet him herself. She did not send an assistant. She did not manage the moment for effect. She met him at the door and shook his hand and said, "Come in." The meeting lasted 2 hours, then an hour more. He signed with Vela on a Friday afternoon. Imara called Carla Vinson when the papers were fully executed and said, "Do you remember what you told me after the contracts course?" Carla laughed and said she remembered. Imara said, "You were right," Carla said. "I usually am. Tell me the rest of it over dinner." Sterling Pruitt learned about the signing from the trades on Monday morning. He sat with it for a moment. He was not, it should be said, without self-awareness. He had been in this industry for long enough to recognize certain shapes when they arrived. This was one of them. He made a note to look at the Vela client list more carefully, because an agency that could attract Marcus Webb was an agency that had done something worth understanding. He was 8 years too late to understand it from the inside. He had had the chance, once, to listen past the fourth line. He had not. On the first Monday of each month, Imara Cole held an open hour at Vela Talent, not for clients, not for industry meetings. For young actors specifically, actors who were in the phase she had been in at 28, 29, 30, building a record, navigating a system that was not designed to make the navigation simple, trying to understand how the room worked so that they could find their way into it. She had started the open hour in Vela's second year, when a young woman had emailed the agency address asking for advice with such careful, dignified precision that Imara had recognized in the email the specific quality of someone who did the work before being asked to and who deserved a response. She had responded. They had met. The young woman, a 26-year-old actress named Zara from Baltimore who had been doing exactly what Imara had done at her age, submitting directly to casting directors and building her record with the patient faith of someone who had not yet reached the threshold, had spent an hour with Imara and had left with a reading list, two specific relationships Imara had offered to make, and the observation that Imara had made at the end of the hour, quietly, as a person states a thing they have spent a long time knowing. The rejection is not information about your talent. The rejection is information about the room. Learn to tell the difference. Zara had written it down. The reading list was in the folder, the one Imara kept in her work bag rather than a box, alongside the conservatory acceptance letter and Celestine's note and Robert Farley's evaluation and 4 other documents she considered foundational. On the morning she added it, she had looked at the folder for a moment. Then she had taken out a new document and put it on top. The document was a single page. At the top it had a date. The date Sterling Pruitt had hung up the phone. Below the date, one sentence. Who do I need to become to do this well? And below the question, in the handwriting of a woman who had been answering it for 8 years, the note she had written the night of the phone call, the night she sat at the cleared kitchen table with the blue tape still on the floor, the night she had decided to finish the monologue to the empty room. You give the material its full weight. You do not rush it. You let the silence do its work. You understand that the person receiving the story is in a relationship with you, and that the relationship requires something from both sides. She had not written it about acting. Or rather, she had written it about acting because acting was where she had learned it. But the thing it described was larger than any one form it lived in. It was the practice. The one Celestine had modeled, and that Robert Farley had named, and that 11 days of preparation for a 4-line audition had not wasted because the preparation was never for Sterling Pruitt. The preparation was always for the work. The work was always the point. The silence does its work when you let it. The room you build for yourself is larger than the one that wouldn't let you in. The thing I cannot put down is the tape on the floor. Blue painter's tape. A rectangle, the size of a standard audition mark, on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles, at 33 years old, alone, because she believed that how you do the work when no one is watching is the only reliable indicator of who you will be when they are. She did not tape the floor for Sterling Pruitt. She taped the floor for herself, because the work deserved the right conditions, even when the conditions were a kitchen and the audience was an empty room, because the material had weight, and the weight required that she stand in the right place to hold it. That is not a lesson about acting. That is a lesson about every room you have ever prepared for that did not receive what you brought to it. The question I want to hold with you is this, and I mean the real answer, not the gracious one. Is there something you have been preparing that you stopped preparing because the room didn't receive it? Not gave you a hard review, not asked you to revise, didn't receive it, clicked. Before the 4th line, what was the material? One word in the comments. Not the person who hung up, the material. The thing you had prepared, the thing that was worth finishing even when the line went dead. Because I want you to know not as reassurance, but as the record that the tape on the floor is the thing that mattered. Not the call, the tape, the 11 days. The glass of water on the counter. The decision to finish the monologue to the empty room. The empty room is not the final room. It never was. Share this with someone who is standing in a kitchen with tape on the floor right now. Someone who is preparing for something that the world has not yet shown up to receive. They need to hear that the preparation is not wasted. It is the point. Subscribe. Because these stories do not run out, and neither do the people inside them, and I am not finished telling you what perseverance actually looks like when you see it up close. And next time, I want to tell you about a 69-year-old Ghanaian-American architect who spent 27 years submitting the same community center design to a city board that kept tabling it. And on the morning they tabled it for the ninth time, a foundation called from a city 400 miles away and offered him the budget, the land, and the timeline. No committee required. Same story. Different blueprints. Same hands that refused to stop drawing. I will see you there.